Well, welcome back from the break. My name is Charles Reince. I'm the head of the School of Art and Design History here at Kingston, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's keynote, who is Joel Sanders. And Joel is an architect practicing in New York City and is Associate Professor Adjunct at Yale University. Prior to joining Yale, Joel taught at Princeton University and Parsons School of Design, where he was director of the graduate program in architecture. His work has been featured in numerous international exhibitions, including Open House at the Vitra Design Museum, Glamour at SF MoMA, New Hotels for Global Nomads at the Cooper Hewitt Museum, and the Biennale de Sao Paulo, and also, I think quite significantly, in the Unprivate House exhibition at New York's Museum of Modern Art. His projects designed in his practice belong to the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, SF MoMA, and the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And his work has been showcased in numerous publications, including Architecture, Interior Design, Architectural Record, the New York Times, Wallpaper, and A+U. He is the winner of the first place for the Seongbuk-dong residences in Seoul in Korea. And Joel has also received numerous awards, including 5 New York AIA Design Awards, the 2008 Interior Design Magazine Best of the Year Award, and an AIA Westchester Mid-Hudson Chapter Honor Award. Many of you will know Joel through his writings and his edited collection, Stud Architectures of Masculinity, and he frequently writes about art and design, most recently for Art Forum, Harvard Design Magazine, and Monticelli Press has recently released a monograph of his work, Joel Sanders Writing Projects. I think probably what's most significant about Joel is the sustained nature of his career in both academia and practice. And I think as we approach questions of the impact of our research as academics into our professions and practice, I think Joel is a kind of model of that sustained relationship, and I think we have a lot to consider from Joel's work. So please welcome Joel Sanders.
Thank you, Charles, for that most generous introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful conference, where I'm already learning such a great deal from my colleagues. Working across the Atlantic in my New York-based design studio, over the years I have pursued research projects that, stemming from my own experience as a designer, consider how history and criticism might shed light on questions that impact contemporary practice. And perhaps great minds really do think alike, or perhaps it's just uncanny, but for better or for worse, my own research has overlapped with topics being explored here at the Modern Interiors Research Center at Kingston University over the years. And first, back in 2006, I was invited to deliver a keynote for a conference entitled Professionalism of Decoration, Design in the Modern Interior. And my talk, Curtain Wars Revisited, was based on a conference I organized back in 1999 at the New School. And it was spawned by, again, my own personal frustrating experiences as a practitioner attempting to design interiors that breached the worlds of architecture and interior decoration. And at that time, I argued that the professional rivalries that divide architects from interior designers are fueled, at least in part, by deep-seated cultural prejudices about gender and sexuality. So 5 years later, it is a privilege to be invited back to Kingston by Penny Spark and the conference organizers, all of you who are in this room, which is another event that, again, that happens to coincide with another central issue that's been preoccupying my recent teaching and practice, which also, in an uncanny way, I call interface, this issue of the integration of landscape and architecture. And this kind of interest in interface began about 6 years ago when I met a colleague of mine, Diana Belmori, a noted landscape architect. And together, well, I would say sometimes working alone and sometimes working together, we have been kind of pursuing projects that from their very inception attempt to bring together architects and landscape designers to create designs that employ ecological principles to weave together indoors and outdoors, natural and synthetic architecture and landscape. And interface for us takes place at different scales. I'm not going to talk much about my work, but just to give you an example, this is a Project Broadway penthouse. It's in New York City. And here in Ipe roof deck, an indigenous planting flow from the roof terrace into the center of the loft, creating a living green core that separates private master bedroom from public living area. And actually, I think it maybe talks exactly to what Pat was talking about, a kind of preoccupation with reversing modernism's indoor-outdoor flow and having the outside come in for a change. And working at a very different scale. I say this with a little bit of bitterness here in England, because back in 2003, when New York was competing with London to host to sponsor the 2012 Olympics, we were asked by the Olympic Committee in New York to design an equestrian center. And what we attempted to do here was use this sort of pattern of printed dots, printed on a temporary scrim, and planted dots on this earth berm to kind of blur that boundary between the kind of object stadium and the landscape. But working together, but also teaching studios at Yale dedicated to interface, Diana and I have often found that our interface initiative has been frustrated or impeded by long-standing disciplinary divisions that, strangely reminiscent for me of curtain wars, again are frustrating the alliances between two respective and overlapping disciplines, architecture and landscape. And at least since the 19th century, architecture and landscape have been professionally segregated. Constituted as independent fields, each has its own curriculum and licensing procedures. More often than not, landscape architects are hired, as Diana often says to me, to shrub up the freestanding buildings designed by architects. And so my talk is predicated on the assumption that the challenge of developing a new model of professional practice, one that is both formally and programmatically sophisticated and also environmentally responsible, requires us to examine how we ever came to this impasse in the first place. In other words, it's imperative to understand the ideological roots of what I'm referring to as the architecture-landscape divide in order to transcend it. And I come to this material from an American perspective, although my remarks will largely focus on what I will refer to as the architecture-landscape divide as it occurred in the United States from the mid-19th century until today. I hope that my insights will be relevant to this conference with its particular emphasis on the relationship between interiors and landscapes. Perhaps it goes without saying that interiors, by their very nature, cannot be conceived of independently from the buildings that enclose them, nor from the building envelope that mediates and ultimately defines the relationship between interior and exterior, indoors and outdoors. The architectural landscape schism, I think, can be traced back to antiquity, to another deep-seated yet suspect Western polarity, the opposition between humans and nature, and thus between buildings and landscapes. And one version of the human-nature dualism finds its home in an influential body of thought that arose in 19th century America, the concept of wilderness. The idea of wilderness is so ingrained in the American conscience through literature, philosophy, and even notions of gender and sexuality that I think it has effectively shaped the design approaches and even codes of professional conduct that in many ways still define the relationship between architecture and landscape practice today. Scholars have traced the intellectual origins of American environmentalism to Henry David Thoreau and John Muir. American writers who, active in the second half of the 19th century, advanced this concept of wilderness. Here they are, I'm sorry. Indebted to 18th century Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and romantics like William Wordsworth, This generation of American writers celebrated the ethical and spiritual benefits of living in unspoiled nature, uncontaminated by America's rising, burgeoning urban industrial civilization. This account of the relationship between humans and nature marks a pronounced reversal in American thinking about landscape. Until the second half of the 19th century, the settlement of the American frontier was predicated on the Judeo-Christian belief that it was the responsibility of humankind to cultivate wilderness, traditionally perceived to be a desolate place, located on the margins of civilization and associated with terror and bewilderment. Moses' 40-year exodus in the desert and Christ's struggle with Satan in the wilderness are but two biblical examples that shapes a much older conception of the wild in America, that it was considered a domain fraught with moral and spiritual confusion that needed to be tamed by men. And such a consideration of wilderness perpetuated not only the human nature divide, but also ingrained ideas about the nature of gender. Relying on the long-standing personification of nature as a woman, feminist critics like Carolyn Merchant have shown that the rhetoric underlying the expansion and settlement of the American continent was founded on biblical accounts of the expulsion from Eden, the fall brought about by a woman. Wilderness was depicted as an unruly female to be subdued and ultimately cultivated through the labor of men, whose goal was to recover paradise lost on earth. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "This great savage country should be furrowed by the plow and combed by the harrow. How much better when the whole land is a garden and the people have grown in the bowers of paradise." For feminists, this biblical injunction was reinforced by yet another gendered Western dualism that opposed material and immaterial, mind and body. Rationalist thinking, considered a male prerogative, made possible the scientific revolution and a corresponding conception of Mother Earth as a passive body subjected to male domination through technology, a worldview that many ecofeminists argue persists today. But by the mid-19th century, the American frontier had been settled. Environmentalists like Thoreau, Muir, and Theodore Roosevelt were confronted with an intimidating prospect, not that different than what we're confronted with today, the disappearance of wilderness. This impending loss of the majestic scenery of the American continent, which they believed surpassed even the man-made monuments of Europe, threatened national identity. Fueled by a surge in cultural nationalism and a nostalgia for a rapidly vanishing frontier, early environmental activism represented a remarkable shift in wilderness thinking. The spiritual grounding of the young nation had come to depend on the preservation, not the subjugation, of the natural landscape. As Thoreau wrote, "And wilderness is the preservation of the world." By the turn of the 20th century, the vanishing wilderness also paralleled and imperiled male masculinity. Associated with yet another authentically American trait, rugged individualism, wilderness was regarded as a source of masculine vigor and vitality. The home of the frontiersman and the cowboy, wilderness represented a safe haven, a refuge where men could resist the emasculating, domesticating forces of urban culture. Thomas Roosevelt famously championed the establishment of America's first national parks because they countered what he said were the flabbiness and slothful ease and promoted, quote, "that vigorous manliness for the lack of which in a nation, as in an individual, the possession of no other qualities can possibly atone." Ironically, this nostalgic image of the wild was advanced by an elite class who reaped the benefits of the wealth generated by industrial capitalism, but found their privileges and authority eroded by cultural developments like immigration and women's rights. For wilderness champions like Roosevelt and Muir, who both belonged to this moneyed class, nature, the repository of threatened individual authenticity, was now recast as a different kind of woman, not as a venerable Mother Nature, but as a defenseless virgin in desperate need of stewardship by red-blooded American males. Today, many still cling to this nostalgic American myth of unspoiled nature as a setting where the individual can actualize his or her authentic subjectivity, a prerogative traditionally accorded to men. First articulated by writers like Roosevelt and Muir in the 19th century, this notion has been disseminated in the 20th and 21st century by popular culture. For example, the classic Hollywood Western Stagecoach, made in 1939, presented John Wayne's angular profile against the backdrop of Monument Valley. And since the 1950s, as you know, wilderness has been a favorite setting for print advertisements and television commercials. Wilderness today is no longer an exclusively straight male domain. Today, films and ads feature women as well as men in the great outdoors, driving fast cars, scaling mountains. In a twist on the genre of the Western, Brokeback Mountain naturalizes the same-sex desire of its two leading male characters by setting them against a panoramic mountain range. While these media-manufactured images have become more inclusive, I think they are nevertheless updated versions of this 19th century dualistic thinking that spawned them. Contemporary American media continues to generate escapist fantasies that represent untouched, unspoiled nature as the preserve of identity unconstrained by urban culture. But not only did wilderness, as expressed in literature and popular culture, form the foundation of American environmentalist thinking, I think it also exerted a direct and profound influence on the subsequent development of two overlapping but increasingly diverging fields: architecture and landscape architecture. The dualistic conception of humanity and nature only reinforced the long-standing Western conception of buildings as constructed artifacts that are qualitatively different from their ostensibly natural surroundings. Ideologies shape not only design philosophies, but also professional conduct. If buildings were different than landscapes, then a new type of landscape professional was required to fill the gap and complement the work of architects. In 1899, a diverse group of gardeners, horticulturalists, and designers, under the leadership of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., established a professional academy, what is today the American Society of Landscape Architects. Over the years, wilderness core values, its valoration of pristine nature as the preserve of authentic individualism, an ambivalent relationship to culture, technology, and the built environment have, I think, resurfaced in various guises, reconnecting the work of a first generation of 19th century American landscape architects, led by Frederick Law Olmsted, who were directly indebted to their wilderness peers, to three subsequent generations of 20th century modernist critics and landscape designers, who I'll briefly talk about today. They include Hitchcock. Well, I'll talk about who they are. And I guess my real point in this little historical journey is that I think these values and this way of thinking infects and shapes, I think, the way many landscape architects and architects are working today. Yet another undercurrent, I would argue, spawned by wilderness thinking, connects this lineage of landscape practitioners. By positing that the human is entirely outside the natural, wilderness presents designers with a fundamental paradox. The historian William Cronin writes, "If we allow ourselves to believe that nature to be true must always be wild, then our very presence in it represents its fall. The place where we are is the place where nature is not." Wilderness, then, presents designers with a thorny dilemma: how to reconcile the ideal of untouched nature with the imprint of humans and with human design. I think there's been a kind of guilty conscience fostered by this conundrum that has haunted American landscape architects and actually architects. And I think this dilemma, as I'll argue, is compounded by the negative connotations of design nature, with decoration, with domesticity, and with femininity. The result, I think, is a deep and persistent suspicion of design nature that still endures today. The pioneering work of Frederick Law Olmsted, the founding father of American landscape architecture, is fraught with contradictions that I think betray the paradoxes at the heart of wilderness thinking. Unlike Muir, who turned his back on cities to find redemption in the pristine American landscape, Olmsted fully embraced making nature accessible to urban citizens. In his role as the leader of landscape architecture, Olmsted sought to legitimate the emerging profession by differentiating it from gardening. He insisted that it was an art, not a trade. In a letter he writes, the rank of even a trade, even of a handicraft. I'm trying to elevate landscape to that of a profession, an art of design in capital letters. Nevertheless, Olmsted's conception of landscape architecture as design proved inconsistent with the guiding premise of his aesthetic philosophy. He believed communion with nature depended on exposing people to a simulacrum of natural scenery, unspoiled by any evidence of human intervention. Upholding this kind of nature-culture polarity, Olmsted conceived of Central Park as a natural oasis inscribed within the dense metropolis, an oasis that could afford the weary urbanite refuge from the industrial city through the rejuvenating effects of the visual contemplation of nature. I think in a passage that exemplifies yet another long-standing Western duality, the mind-body split, Olmsted wrote, "As what is well designed to nourish the body and enliven the spirits through the stomach makes a dinner, so what is well designed to recreate the mind from urban oppression through the eye makes the park the park." And I guess what I want to emphasize here is that it's a specific, we think of parks today as a kind of about embodied recreation. For Olmsted, he emphasizes again and again, it's about a kind of optical contemplation that leads to rejuvenation. And my point is that renewal is predicated on artifice achieved through carefully composed pastoral views made possible by what he wrote was screening out incongruous objects and replacing them with a kind of new dematerialized horizon line composed as much as possible of, these are quotes from Olmsted, of verdure. He wrote that allowed the viewer to withdraw the mind to an indefinite distance from all objects associated with streets and city walls. And also for this reason, Olmsted came up with this kind of brilliant kind of park section that again screened not only buildings but through traffic from people in the park. In subsequent projects like Prospect Park and much later the Boston Riverway, Olmsted again grappled with the ostensible incompatibility between nature and metropolitan design. Although they were massive infrastructural projects requiring advanced technology, engineering, and design, Olmsted ultimately disguised their constructed character by employing a pastoral vocabulary that viewers then and now assumed to be natural. And I think even today, my point is there's a kind of default identification between nature and the conventions of a kind of Olmstedian picturesque that has become integral to landscape perception. Anne Spurn writes, "Today the work of the landscape, the profession of the landscape architecture is often not seen, not understood to have been designed and deliberately constructed, even when the landscape has been radically reshaped." At the outset of the 20th century, Olmsted was the acknowledged leader of a growing new profession with the potential to guide the design of America's burgeoning metropolitan regions. Only 30 years later, however, a new generation of landscape architects seemed to have lost its way, struggling to invent a robust landscape vocabulary that would complement the achievements of their architectural peers. This group found its efforts stymied, I would argue, by, again, the supposed incompatibility between nature and design. Many contemporary critics and architects bemoaned this professional vacuum. One example, in Gardens in the Modern Landscape, one of the few books devoted to the subject, English critic Christopher Tunnard writes, "For the garden of today cannot be called contemporary in spirit, as can the movements in architecture, sculpture, or painting. It is not of our time, but of the sentimental past, a body with no head, with very little heart. Imagination is dead, romance a mere excuse for extravagance in decoration." The catalog for contemporary landscape architecture and its sources, an exhibition curated by Henry Russell Hitchcock at the San Francisco Museum of Art, today what's called the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. This was a show in 1937. I think underscored the crisis surrounding the profession's inability to devise a compelling new modernist landscape vocabulary. A concern that would be echoed by landscape critics and designers for the next 25 years. And again, I say this as a humble designer who's sort of like maybe trespassing into the fields of history, but even in my small research, I was so struck with over and over and over again this kind of backbeating in the profession of landscape's inability to kind of, again, construct this kind of robust kind of architectural vocabulary. So here's Henry Russell Hitchcock stepping in, I think, to save the day. His objective was to do for landscape what he did at MoMA's 1932 Modern Architecture International Style Exhibition, was to basically, I think, legitimate a new movement by bringing together a range of projects that he believed exemplified the tenets of a new school. In contrast to MoMA's persuasive demonstration of the capacity of modern architecture to shape a broad range of building types from single-family residences to factories, the San Francisco curators narrowly defined the problem of the modern landscape as belonging exclusively to residential design. In other words, the title of the show is Modern Landscape, but all the examples in the show are residences, which I think is interesting and revealing. In the process, Hitchcock grafted principles from architecture to landscape architecture, transferring modern architecture's famed prohibition against ornament to its sister discipline. He advocated that the landscape designer renounce their propensity for decorative ornamental planting and instead concentrate on functional concerns. He writes, "The most successful contemporary technique is neither embellishment nor improvement." Conflating two design professionals, the interior decorator and the gardener, who he saw as threatening the integrity of buildings by adorning them with applied ephemeral materials, Hitchcock cautioned against the use of flowers, writing that flower beds, quote, "serve primarily a decorative purpose, like curtains or upholsteries indoors, subordinate to the useful general purpose of the terrace," unquote. Interestingly enough, Hitchcock justifies his prescriptive guidelines by perpetuating two mutually reinforcing perceptions that modern architects have used to denigrate two sister disciplines, landscape and interiors. Landscape professionals, like interior decorators, concern themselves with trivial pursuits, the decoration of residential properties for the idle rich. And architects, they're unlike architects who are concerned themselves with fundamental, essential human problems. And clearly this identification of both interior design and garden design with decoration tapped into deep-seated disciplinary assumptions tinged by gender prejudices. In Curtain Wars, I argue that since the late 19th century, interior decoration has been regarded as a pastime associated with feminine artifice and masquerade. Unlike architects who are engaged in an ostensibly masculine pursuit, who organize space by manipulating hard, permanent elements, walls and structure, Decorators, stereotypically women and gay men, dressed the rooms configured by men using ephemeral materials and elements associated with fashion, soft fabrics, and applied surfaces like wallpapers, paint, and curtains. And I think in a similar vein, gender prejudices also shaped cultural perceptions of landscape, a practice that also relies on the most ephemeral of materials, organic materials, trees, plants, and flowers, to adorn, again, the stable constructions created by architects. Moreover, unlike architecture, considered a cerebral enterprise, apprehended intellectually, gardens, like tactile interiors, elicit visceral pleasures stimulated by the textures, colors, and scents of Mother Nature. If, in a strict modernist view, all of landscape, whether cultivated or tamed, was considered to be an accessory to architecture, then gardens are inevitably even more inconsequential, as they repudiated ornament based on its association with feminine adornment. Modernists like Hitchcock also condemned, as we saw, decorative plantings, which again they equated directly with womanly fashion, artifice, and deception. While international style architects focused on pressing social issues, landscape designers, like interior designers, devoted their attention to the inconsequential and devalued domain of the female homemaker. In short, the discipline of landscape could redeem itself only by transcending its own tainted history as a superficial pastime affiliated with women. These prejudices, I think, were not exclusive to Hitchcock, but they would soon be reiterated by subsequent generations of landscape professionals, and though often unconscious, I still think they are pervasive today. Ironically, while intended to elevate the low profile of the landscape profession, Hitchcock's exhibition upheld the preeminence of architecture by arguing that landscape designers extend architectural principles from indoors to outdoors. Imposing another key tenet of modern architecture on landscape functionalism, he contends that designers should treat garden terraces as literal extensions of the interior, as rooms that promote functional activities. And I think that this kind of idea of the outdoor room as an extension of architecture embodies an approach to marrying modern buildings and landscapes that still dominate the profession today. For Hitchcock maintained that he said that the spaces immediately adjacent to the house should be treated architecturally, but those farther away from the building should be left intact. The house with its living terraces form a single unit, he wrote, controlled by geometrical design principles, set down on a well-chosen site, otherwise completely untouched. And I think this statement evokes the modernist paradigm of the machine in the garden, a conception exemplified in such pre-war domestic masterpieces as the Villa Savoy and the post-war Farnsworth House. These post and pre-war icons conjure the image of the isolated building set in a pastoral setting, as found in 17th century landscape paintings, as well as 18th and 19th century naturalistic gardens reconceived for the 20th century. And in a passage, interestingly enough, I found cited by Thenard, a passage from Le Corbusier's Précision, Corb writes, "I shall place this house on columns in a beautiful corner of the countryside. Grass will border the roads, nothing will be disturbed, neither the trees, the flowers, nor the flocks and herds. The dweller in these houses, drawn hence through the love of life of the countryside, will be able to see it maintained from their hanging gardens or from their ample windows. Their domestic lives will be set in a Virgilian dream." And I think Le Corbusier's passage captures mainstream modern's romantic, hands-off vision of the landscape, as well as his understanding of the key role that technology plays in negotiating this interplay between man-made and natural. The Savoy and the Farnsworth were both conceived of as suspended objects that, through new technologies, the curtain wall and the steel frame, leave nature deceptively unspoiled. Architecture now appropriates a responsibility one shared with landscape design, something that's been an obsession in this conference over the 2 days, this idea of the framed view. While buildings in the West have largely been conceived of as objects, I think independent from the landscape, nevertheless, architects working in concert with gardeners have employed devices, we've seen them, like French doors that lead to porches that are then aligned with trees and hedges, that all are there or all designed to articulate a smooth transition between inside and outside. But now divorced from the ground plane, the elevated house allows detached spectators confined within the interior to observe carefully composed views of an ostensibly pristine landscape. At the Villa Savoy, 2 apertures, the cinematic ribbon window and the rectangle cut in the curved roof parapet, I think shoulder the burden of framing vistas, now becoming the sole mediating device between indoors and outdoors, landscape and architecture. Likewise, the static curtain wall assumes this role at the Farnsworth House, making possible this conception of nature as a spectacle for visual contemplation. I think in this way, 2 unequally matched disciplines, modern architecture and modern landscape, together reinforce the nature-culture, mind-body dualism, effectively confirming nature and architecture, and as a consequence, landscape and interiors as fundamentally opposed entities. And by the way, my intention is not to vilify these 2 buildings. They're like my all-time favorite buildings in the history of architecture, but rather just to argue that they exemplify what I think is one mainstream prevailing attitude that I believe governs modern architecture's conception of building and landscape. And moving ahead, it was the responsibility of a next generation of American landscape architects, including Garrett Ekbo and James Rose, classmates in the landscape architecture program at Harvard, when Gropius was there in the 30s, to find a way to reconcile the design landscape with the nature-culture mentality underlying modern architecture. And again, I'm seeing that the time is going forward, so I'll go very quickly, but they also obsessively are preoccupied with finding, with a kind of professional inferiority complex, and their goal is to find a way of elevating the discipline of landscape to the dignity achieved by modern landscape. By modern architects. And again, how do they do this? Like Hitchcock, they embrace terminology borrowed from modern architecture, a kind of, they say, a scientific or structural approach. But I think what's interesting, and it's really already been pointed out today by our speakers this morning, that these 2 practitioners came back after school. They came back to California. They allied themselves with a kind of loosely defined California school of modernist landscape designers, people like Thomas Church and Lawrence Halprin. And I think what's interesting for me is that I think they represent an alternative approach that seeks an alternative to this idea of the machine in the garden. They endeavored to take advantage of West Coast's gentle climate, or perhaps they bought into this misguided idea that Pat brings up and Margaret of the West Coast's wonderful climate. But in other words, they tried to find a way of facilitating this kind of indoor-outdoor living. But they had very few practitioners in their own field, very few role models to follow. And instead, they looked to works like Frank Lloyd Wright, Schindler, Neutra, case study architects, who I think, again, represent a departure from this prevailing conception of the self-contained object building with nature as a foil. And for me, and I'm grossly generalizing here, but I think these architects instigate indoor-outdoor continuity via architectural means. They work, in other words, with man-made materials, not organic materials like landscape architects do. They extend, again, principally materials like patios, roof overhangs, from inside to outside. But the question I'm interested in is, but what contribution could landscape architects make to this initiative without resorting to a familiar vocabulary? And this is going to take more time, so I'll go quickly. But what's fascinating, they don't look to their own profession or even to architecture, but for the most part to this kind of accepted, but really to art. to this exceptional group of maverick, rarely considered landscape designers like, mispronounced the name, Gabriel Gaverkian, Pierre Legrand, but more importantly to also like their contemporaries, Burle Marx, Noguchi, they looked to art, to surrealism and cubism, okay? And the outcome was a series of modernist residential designs, widely published in popular periodicals like Sunset Magazine in the 40s and 50s, that borrowed abstract motifs and forms from a variety of modern art sources, like Van Doesburg, Moreau, John Arp. And in projects like this one, the Burden Garden here, Ekbo directly acknowledges his inspiration from Kandinsky, creating a residential garden that merges indoors and outdoors by featuring the kind of signature motifs, circles and dynamic diagonals derived from Kandinsky. Perhaps the most resolved example of this approach is Church's Donnell Garden of 1948, whose dynamic composition combines zigzag stone walls, curved biomorphic plantings, and a kidney-shaped pool. But I think this fertile period of small-scale residential experimentation was short-lived. Ekbo and Rose, like many of their post-war peers in America, gradually withdrew from taking on the residential commissions that were the bread and butter of so many noted American landscape designers like Charles Platt, Warren Manning, and Ruth Dean at the turn of the century, and their contemporaries in the 50s like Church. I think small-scale residential projects came to be regarded as the domain of the amateur female homemaker, not the trained professional, due at least in part to the emergence of mass marketing publications like House Beautiful. And instead, the people like Ekbo and Rose, and like their peers, Sosowski Associates illustrated here, shifted their focus to large-scale commissions like university campuses, corporate office parks, and suburban subdivisions, modeling their practices on such architectural entities as HOK, SOM. Ekbo and his colleagues joined the ranks of a generation of corporate landscape firms that would dominate the profession for years to come. And these are, well, I'll go forward, sorry. Anyway, another post-war practitioner, Ian McHarg, also preferred to think big. Like Olmsted, he worked at a scale even larger than that of his corporate peers. He often partnered with state and federal agencies as he tackled the infrastructural challenges of formulating ecologically minded master plans that could transform entire metropolitan regions. A charismatic professor and a self-promoting public intellectual who disseminated his ideas through print and television, McHarg outlined his ecological approach in Design with Nature, a book that grappled with an Olmstedian ambivalence about the role design plays in reshaping urban environments. For McHarg, writing in 1969, Olmsted's worst predictions had been realized. Rapacious capitalism, aided by remarkable technological advances, had tipped the precarious balance between nature and civilization, resulting in environmental casualties, America's polluted, slum-ridden cities. He described urban dwellers as patients in mental hospitals, consigned to live in God's junkyard. And I think, like Olmsted, McHarg aspired to redeem what had become America's sprawling and decaying metropolitan regions. But how? For McHarg, landscape architecture again had little to teach. He attacked his profession along the same lines advanced by Steele, Tarnard, and Rose. In a chapter entitled On Values, he restated a recurring disciplinary debate that pits French formal school against the English naturalist school, and he dismissed the achievement of Lenotre by enlisting a familiar argument, again tinged with gender prejudices. He deplores the I'm quoting him, the ornamental quality of plants used to impose order on a submissive, flat, and docile landscape. And instead, McHarg praised you, the English, or many of you in this room, as the precursor of his own ecological approach. He said nature itself produced the aesthetic here in England. It was the precursor for ecology. As the title Design with Nature attests, McHargue also wrestled with the issue of reconciling design and nature. But McHargue pursued a different course from Olmsted, who smoothed over the paradox of constructing nature by concealing art, engineering, and infrastructure with a design vocabulary that appears to be natural. Likewise, he departs from modernists like Tunnard, Steele, Church, Ekbo, and Rose, who strive to wed functionalist precepts to abstract form-making derived from the fine arts. Instead, McHargue turned to the natural sciences, not only interested in new materials or technologies, not really interested in new materials or technologies. He nevertheless shared the preoccupation of contemporaries like Buckminster Fuller and Frei Otto, or following in the footsteps of such 19th century designers as Viollet-le-Duc, Ernst Haeckel, and René Binet. He was interested in what he thought were the underlying laws for form generation in nature. He thought that natural scientists were like what engineers were for Le Corbusier. He writes, consequently, the astronomer and geologist, the plant and animal morphologist, are just as concerned and competent in the business of meaningful form as the painter. And in a quasi-functionalist argument reminiscent of Le Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture, he advises designers to study and emulate the morphology of plants and animals, not the work of engineering. And I think here, by identifying the natural sciences as a bridge between the constructed and the natural, McHargue makes a more convincing claim for the integration of science and design than his functionalist-inspired predecessors, people like Rose and Ekbo. No longer now specific to architecture, science becomes the legitimate purview of the landscape architect, who, guided by ecological principles, was now capable of generating seemingly inevitable designs grounded in the logic of science that integrated the built and the natural without resorting to art. And this is what I think is important, and I think this is a recurring theme in architecture and landscape architecture, this appeal to somehow the objective laws of science as a way of avoiding the vagaries, the contingencies of design. And he writes, I conceive of non-ecological design as either capricious, arbitrary, or idiosyncratic, and it is certainly irrelevant. Non-ecological design and planning disdains reason and emphasizes intuition. It is anti-scientific by assertion. Okay? And I'm not trying to demonize McHargue. He's amazingly important. He's the forerunner of ecological design that's so important today. But he does betray, I think, this guilty conscience, this suspicion of design, of art, okay, of the imprint of human art on landscape. And we know he, again, pioneered this important methodology, which is very, very influential today. But I think my point is that his comprehensive regional proposals, generated through a process-oriented approach, grounded in the supposedly objective logic of the natural sciences, largely evaded design. His master plans were too large, too conceptual and abstract, to engage issues of form, space, and materials, and in particular the human body, in a way that, for better or for worse, traditional garden designs once did. So while McHargue's design approach coincided with and reflected the process-oriented ecological values that dominated the 1960s and the 70s, his philosophy nevertheless portrays what I think is the same struggle to come to terms with the supposed incompatibility of nature and design that preoccupied, when I'm arguing, was the kind of obsession of two generations of American designers before him. I think, like his predecessors, McHargue revisits many of the same wilderness-inflected themes that he inherited from the 19th century. And to summarize, what are they? A dualist way of thinking that views nature as a vulnerable, essentially feminine entity that must be protected from the predatory interests of humans, and in particular of architects. Landscape must be protected against architecture. Two, that there's a professional bias against design nature, which is dismissed as a frivolous pursuit affiliated with residential gardening, decoration, and artifice. And thirdly, a preference for large-scale problem solving based upon a deterministic design approach justified by science. And I'll just go forward, but I think that my point here is that I think that this design approach, this is the work of James Corner, one of the most important landscape architects working today, doing amazing work. But I think he, a student of McHarg, he teaches at Penn where McHarg taught. There's a similar, I think, mentality that again sets their sights on large-scale infrastructure rather than medium or small-scale commissions that I think are important, but I think they're apt to generate ambitious abstract proposals that again map a methodology driven by ecology at the expense sometimes of formal factors. And I think this legacy of wilderness core values not only inhibits alliances between architects and landscape architects, but also between interior designers and landscape designers. Its dualistic worldview conceives of interiors like architecture as a human endeavor, an art that intrinsically exists in opposition to the natural. Moreover, ingrained disciplinary biases further undermine the marriage of landscape and interiors. In the same way that interiors are literally subsumed within the building, shell that separates inside from outside, interior design is considered a subordinate branch of architecture. Interiors and landscapes, two fields devalued because of their pejorative association with femininity, domesticity, and decoration, in the end must be controlled, must be regulated by architecture, the kind of master discipline. I think, in short, architects and the buildings they make both literally and figuratively impede, maybe this is a bad analogy, the marriage of two fields. Architecture, like a stern but perhaps well-meaning parent, gets in the way, forbidding the union of their potentially unruly offspring interiors with a kind of brash interloper landscape who's coming to kind of abduct their daughter. And I don't have time here to kind of maybe get into this argument, but I also think that the residue of wilderness thinking very quickly not only inhibits the marriage of architecture and landscape and interiors, but it also, I think, infiltrates and shapes green design, okay? And in a nutshell, I think it's interesting that, again, today, we have two parallel disciplines, landscape and architecture, who are working independently to try to kind of come up with the very important problem of solving ecological issues. This is a kind of case, again, about residential architecture, lead checklists versus kind of landscape. And what I'm always struck by is the way in which products and materials are designed to replicate the environmentally irresponsible ones they replace. Solar panels are attached to sloped roofs or flat roofs. Renewable materials clad the interior and exterior of conventional buildings, and organic fertilizers and indigenous plantings are eco-friendlier ways to make acres of traditional lawn and shrubs that adorn buildings, which are still conceived of as isolated objects. In short, I think green design fosters a product-oriented mentality that generally evaluates materials and techniques on the basis of performance and efficiency, really taking into considerations form and program. But moreover, by taking disciplinary divisions for granted, sustainable design unwittingly, I think, reinforces the root of the problem. This dualistic paradigm of the building, considered as a discrete object, spatially, socially, and ecologically divorced from its site. As a consequence, this American ideal, which is itself derived from wilderness thinking, the ideal of the freestanding house, inhibits designers and manufacturers from treating buildings and landscapes holistically as reciprocal systems that together impact the environment. But might it be possible to jettison these outmoded and environmentally irresponsible prejudices and instead reimagine buildings, interiors, and landscapes as mutually interactive entities? What would it take to foster a new, formally progressive, integrated approach to sustainable landscape and buildings and interiors? one mandated not only to conserve resources, but also to sponsor new forms of interaction among people in social space. Designers must radically readjust their ways of thinking and working. First, wilderness values, the unexamined foundation that still, I think, shapes the perception of what it means to live with nature, must be problematized, must be called into question. Relinquishing wilderness values will allow designers to adopt a more complicated viewpoint advanced by progressive scholars and scientists, a recognition that nature and civilization, although never the same, have always been intertwined and are becoming more so. Climate change reveals that there is not a square inch of the planet that does not in some way bear the imprint of humans. Landscape and culture intermix in various combinations. While constructed elements are more common in urban areas and natural elements predominate in rural zones, organic and synthetic operate as a gradient of differing intensities that form a continuum across the surface of the earth. And I think this new mentality will allow, will impact interior design as well. I think it will allow representatives of three disciplines, architecture, landscape, and interiors, now accorded equal status, to forge productive continuities between interior and exterior. The organic and synthetic are transformed into fields of differing intensities, rather than opposites that belong exclusively to landscape or buildings. As a consequence, designers are encouraged to pay attention to the interface, the seam or overlap where indoors and outdoor meets. I think a critical awareness of the fluid connection between natural and synthetic, exterior and interior space will motivate designers to think about scale, form, and materials in an entirely new way. Materials will now become the connective tissue that enacts the passage between interior, building envelope, and landscape. And for me, most important, the scale of the human body will become the crucial common denominator that bridges the intimate scale of interiors with the more expansive scale associated with the out of doors. Considering the spatial and material junctures that link inside and outside through the lens of the body, through ergonomics, I think can generate new ways of thinking, not only about form, but also about program, positioning human activities both inside and outside in a way that coincides with 21st century notions of what it means to live with nature. And I think since 2000, a new way of working, a new way of thinking has been gaining momentum. And I've co-edited a book, sorry for this plug, it's called Groundworks, Between Landscape and Architecture. It's co-edited with my colleague Diana Balmori. And together we have attempted to document what we believe is a trend of worldwide international architects and landscape architects who are creating what we believe are provocative projects that harness the potential of advances in green materials and techniques to instigate the development of a truly innovative design vocabulary that dissolves the borders between buildings and environment. Rejecting modernism's often unqualified faith in technology and its general indifference to the designed environment, all of these practitioners reject the paradigm of buildings as constructed artifacts floating in a predictable naturalistic landscape. Instead, they conceive of their projects as inventive hybrid landscape architectural solutions that effectively mingle indoors and outdoors, natural and synthetic. And don't have time to show you examples of the book. Hopefully, maybe in Australia, we can talk about them. Also, Philip Rahm and Francois Roche, who Sandra talks about, are also included in the book. We've divided, we have loosely overlapping chapters that have to do with kind of these, we call them these kind of constructed topographies, ecological approaches, and we're also fascinated with the work of a new generation of architects who work with digital biocomputation as also a way of beginning to kind of blur those boundaries between landscape and architecture. Here's Francois Roche, who's also in the book. And the point is that we think that this groundbreaking work is great, but it focuses primarily on dissolving distinctions between object buildings and landscape. I have to confess that very little of this work is addressing what we're addressing today, this kind of mingling of interior and exterior. Hopefully, this conference and its sequel in Australia will help to foster a new direction for interior design by championing a new breed of cross-disciplinary pioneer who recognizes that combining technological, formal, and programmatic innovation will lead to the creation of high-performance environments suited to 21st century life. Thank you very much.